to Next Economy Now. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. The goal of this podcast is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. Our guest today is Joy Anderson, founder and president of Criterion Institute. Criterion Institute is an activist think tank whose mission is to broaden what matters in our economic decisions by expanding who has power and influence in the work of reinventing the economy. Some highlights from my interview with Joy include how her work in the public school system shaped her thoughts about reinventing finance, how she made the jump from teaching to venture capital, why impact investing won't fix the economy without addressing structural inequities like race, gender, and class, the one policy or rule she would change about the economy if she had a magic wand. And finally, we also discuss some of her upcoming trainings where folks can learn about gender lens investing or the role of the church in reinventing the economy. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Joy Anderson. Joy, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Ryan.
Joy, let's start with a little bit of your personal background. Where do you consider home and why?
Wow, that's a good question. So I live in Connecticut and I've been here for about 18 years and I do love it here. But I say that I grew up in Iowa and it was a really formative time. I grew up in the midst of the farm crisis in Iowa, in Dubuque, Iowa, a place that had 25% unemployment at the time and the highest suicide rate in the country. And I learned a lot there about resilience and the complexity of economic change. It was a complicated time to grow up in the midst of so many rapid changes making in an industry and the reality of how that just shows up pretty immediately in human beings' lives.
And I'm kind of curious, the farm crisis was it drought or was it something else? Or
I'm sorry. Yeah, the farm crisis, early 80s, mid 80s, sort of named as the time when the family farm declined at its fundamental level, growth of agribusiness. But you had a period of time in the Midwest. I'm guessing you're not from the Midwest, Ryan, but so there was a period of time in the Midwest where the economy fell out. And so sort of the equivalent of the Silicon Valley collapse for the West Coast, only in the mid 80s in the Midwest. And yeah, farm prices dropped. I mean, there was a packing company in my town and a John Deere company, and both of them had, thousands of layoffs in the span of a couple of years. And the economy in the Midwest just tanked. So
yeah, I'm from Fresno, California, so a lot of agriculture, but a little different. I probably was insulated from that period. Yeah. And I just looking at your background as well, kind of curious. I know you worked in the New York public school system for many years. Could you just speak to how working in the public school system shaped your current thoughts on sort of reinventing finance?
Yeah, no, I talk about it a lot, actually. I think there was a sense teaching high school in New York, and I was in a mainstream high school teaching special ed most of the time, but not solely. And there was a sense that you looked out into the kids and you talked to them and you could tell the difference between the kids who believed they were going to survive the rules and the kids who were going to change the rules. And I mean, it was a kind of pretty clear sense that the rules weren't working for the kids I was teaching. And that became that sort of has become the driving force in my life. At the same time, I got a Ph.D. in 19th century American history, and in that, studying history and being a historian, working in social change broadly, but working in finance in particular, is I can tell you the dates we made this shit up. And there's a kind of sense that when we say to people, this is how it works, this is the rules, this is what you have to fit within. As a historian, I'm much better at being able to say, I'm sorry, those rules have existed for 15 to 20 years. They were invented in a particular context. They responded to those set of norms. And if those norms have changed, then your stupid ass rules should change too. And so that kind of sense of malleability, a sense of responsiveness, and a sense of creativity and imagination. So the combination of a PhD in 19th century American history and a high school teaching career, I think, set me up perfectly to work in social finance.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like the history and also just like the reality of like high school kids in New York, you kind of end up being like, all right, let's get real. Like what's actually happening in the larger systems.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you then, when did you start to be like, okay, when did you start to have the thoughts of, I'm more interested in the financial system than schools? Like, were you still working in public schools when you started to have those ideas?
Heavens. Yeah, no, definitely not. So I made largely through nepotism. My mother was a major client of a consulting firm in the Midwest, and I was living in New York, thought I'd move back to the Midwest, and got a job in a consulting firm in Milwaukee. So moved to Milwaukee for that, and kind of gave up tenure and a kind of cushy political job in New York. And kind of gave it all up and said, I'm going to go do this consulting thing. And turns out the first client that walked in to the consulting firm was a $14 billion pension fund, the Methodist Pension Fund. And so I went from literally being a classroom teacher in June, I was about 29, classroom teacher in June, and went to being on a senior advisory team to the head of a pension fund in August. Obviously, I had a lot of other people around me who were supporting that, but I turned out to be wicked good at strategy, and sort of sat in sort of my testing ground a lot of it was working in the General Board of Pensions and Health Benefits of the United Methodist Church. And actually, I never advised them on investing. I worked on their healthcare strategy for about 6 or 7 years. Sort of emerged into that. I did a lot of different strategy projects from them. I actually started another historical moment, but I started on a team that was doing cleanup from Y2K. And so it was kind of this, I came in as a response to Y2K, and another big consulting firm had kind of made a bunch of mistakes, and we were brought in to be the people who actually understood churches who could respond to this. And just ended up staying. And then, sitting at board meetings and sitting with the general secretary, I was like, oh, they had $1 billion in low-income housing, and they were one of the organizations. They're sort of famous for having set a lot of the standards within low-income housing for pension funds. And they asked a question: what would it look like? Microfinance at that time was just kind of poking its head up. So this was about 10 years ago, and they asked the question: what would it look like to have $1 billion in microfinance? And obviously, they couldn't go out and say, we want to put $1 billion in microfinance without, just being, rushed by a significant number of people who didn't have any good product. So I actually put a dialogue together. Criterion was starting to push our boundaries in terms of what we did for clients versus what we just did because we thought it was a good idea. So we pulled together a dialogue and ended up with about $70-80 billion in the room, including a Midyar and a couple other pension funds, and Axion and Grameen and Wayne Silby and Bob Patillo. And I just networked my way into meeting these people. I didn't really know them, but all of a sudden I had the right invitation, and they came to a table that would say, how would we design how would we design financial instruments to put $1 billion in microfinance? And so fast forward from that, about 6 months later, they came up with some brilliant ideas. Wayne was starting to play out some of his early thinking in terms of how you'd have mixes of philanthropy and debt and equity all in a single vehicle, sort of stuff he's continued to experiment with. And Bob Patillo talked about Grace, the head of Grey Ghost Investments, talked about Grace and cried a little bit in the middle of the peak. He's one of these amazing people who just brings his emotions right to the surface. So it was an incredible gathering. And 6 months later, I kind of looked back and I was like, well, how come Axion and Grameen, how come nobody's moving anything forward? I was just stunned. I was like, nobody's actually doing anything with this. And looked around and realized there was a fairly significant leadership gap. And so from that, I actually kind of on a dare, Kevin Jones had asked me, I don't know, he was working on something. I was challenging him in saying that wasn't actually what he should be working on. And so he kind of dared me to come out to San Francisco and figure out what we should all be working on. And Tim Freundlich joined that meeting, as did Mark Beam. And that was the founding meeting of Good Capital. So Tim and Kevin and I, with Mark right alongside us, decided to form Good Capital. And so that was sort of my overall transition between, I started working at a consulting firm fairly soon after I started working at that consulting firm. I created Criterion. It was about 2 or 3 years. And then from that, kind of started to figure out how do I engage? Where do we see that there's a leadership gap? And it's not that there's some consulting project we're trying to get, but we want to be the entrepreneurs. So Criterion for a while was then a kind of undercapitalized bane of the social sector. We still had some big consulting projects in places like AARP and other sort of big institutional players. But then we would launch new ventures, almost all in finance. I was sort of always looking at sort of how do you shape systems level change. And then I think, you can, the shift that happened about 8 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, was I sort of stepped back and said, while I thought social finance was great, and I was definitely at some of the serious founding tables and had a kind of catbird seat for early days in impact investing, I had a sense that people thought they were going to reinvent the economy and not deal with questions of structural inequities. And we could just kind of create a set of apps that would end poverty. And there was a kind of naivete about that. So over the last 5 years in particular, Criterion has just kind of made that what we focus on, sort of questions of power in reinventing finance.
And was that the switch from a for-profit to a nonprofit around that time?
Yeah, it was about the same time. Some of the switch between a for-profit and a not-for-profit is the business models and the expectations around field building. At some basic level, Criterion has always played a field building role. And there's a limited number of business models, right? You can be a consulting firm that you can consult to people who are trying to build fields. You could be a foundation and fund people building fields. And we were sort of had a very hybrid, it's less true now, but we had a very hybrid financial model at the time. And a chunk of our money was coming from individual philanthropists. It wasn't actually the funding that drove the switch to the nonprofit. It was the credibility. I was always able to get philanthropic dollars, and I knew enough about how to manage finances to know how to sort of work that through a for-profit structure. But the real difference was, in the end, everybody kept asking me, Joy, what's your end game? Like, what do you really want out of this? And I got so tired of being asked that question. Like, I just want to do the work. I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur, even to this day. I mean, I'm described, I suppose, as a social entrepreneur by people. I've launched 6 companies, but I never self-described myself as an entrepreneur. Part of that is just I needed the business that could I needed to have the organizational structure to do the work that I thought needed to get done. So somewhere in the midst of that, being the sole owner of an LLC, people kept asking me, what do you want? And are you going to go back and create another product? Are you going to create another venture fund? Are you going to launch the new gender lens investing product that's going to wipe us all out? I was like, I just want to do the work. And so turning to be a nonprofit was actually a way to signal that this isn't about my personal ownership, but rather a kind of collective social good. So that was my choice, and it made an instant difference. And I love it. I mean, I think I'm agnostic about social structures in general, but it was definitely the right move for us.
So maybe let's dive into some of those structural inequities, because I think that's huge. That I think, as you alluded to, many people, even in the impact investing space, want to just provide sort of well, clearly, if you just did this and this, it would be impact and it would solve. But you're sort of looking more holistically. So, what were some of the structural inequities that you really wanted to focus on with your current work?
Yeah, so sort of being so central to founding the field of gender lens investing, that was first it was just about figuring out that we weren't. So at a surface level, it's kind of simple. Like we could go into sort of deep structural inequities about the ways that domestic violence affects women's potential to engage in the economy. Right? That's what a structural inequity is. Like sort of like in the end, that sort of how gender, race, class, disability, age, sexual orientation, queer identity, whatever you want to put in this sort of broader spectrum, who you are, how you identify yourself, where you sit, defines a significant amount about what's possible for you. And I mean, that's just kind of privilege 101. And in particular, recognizing that there wasn't a conversation about gender for real in impact investing. And so I got to confirm that we weren't having a real conversation about gender. When I first started gender lens investing, sort of conversations about that, people would say to me, oh no, Joy, it's okay. We did the women thing with microfinance. We've totally addressed it. I'm like, are you for real? Did you just say that we've handled women because we gave them access to small loans? Or people would actually say to me, I think it's nice that you're sort of focused on issue areas for women, but I don't really do women. Like, okay, one, you need to have a different phrase to describe that. The second piece is like, women are not an issue area. We're half the bloody population. We're not an issue area subset of impact investing, as if there's some choice. As I'm looking out into a clean tech investment, I'm going to have a reflection about whether or not gender matters in the economy. I get to choose whether or not race is a material issue for the experience of human beings on the planet. I'm just going to, I'm going to say, no, I'm just really interested in the environmental piece. And we have seen over and over and over and over again, with things like environmental racism now, if we're not addressing structural inequities as we're designing all of these cool new innovations, we're going to screw over the same people who've been screwed over before. So where we stepped in terms of, what to do about that, like, I don't know, what am I supposed to do about that, right? But what we noticed was it's about who sees themselves at the table. It's not about who's allowed to be at the table. That sometimes is an issue. It's some level, because there are a lot of rooms. I mean, impact investing is thought of as having more women involved in it, and that's really true. I've been a couple panels recently where some women have shared some pretty horrific stories about sort of sexism that's endemic within impact investing. But we sort of like to think, well, we're the social good people. That means we must be good on things like race and class and gender. And we got that all worked out. And we've dealt with our power issues because, look, we can change the world. So part of it was to say, how can we address who even sees themselves in this project? Right. And that became the core of what Criterion works on. I mean, we're focused on people who are creating social change and working to have the people who are day to day on the ground or in boardrooms, or I don't care where they are. They could be a philanthropist trying to create social change, or a local pastor in Austin, Texas, or the head of a women's rights organization, or the head of UN Women. I don't care where you sit. If you are somebody that is trying to create social change, we would like you to imagine that finance could be a tool for social change. And part of that is the motivation of why a change maker would even come to a table about finance. They'd have to, in the end, believe that this is part of a broader solution and not just, an evil capitalist empire that's undermining humanity as we know it. And so a lot of our sort of conversations are to say, okay, how do we actually, in those moments when everybody's kind of like, oh crap, the finance conversation is happening now, how do we encourage people to lean in? And I don't mean lean in the way Sheryl Sandberg, whatever, just the words lean into the conversation. I don't mean a broader ideological point than that. But how do you actually participate versus stepping back? So I was just this last weekend, I was in Puerto Rico with a group of American Baptist leaders and spent 2 days with them just imagining in their communities, in their work, in the social justice activism that they're doing, in their analysis of the prison industrial complex, what role could finance play? And it turns out they were also part of a denomination that had, a couple $100 million in assets. And so they could think about how to both use those assets, but even more importantly, they have knowledge, like they understand actually what's happening on the ground. They can see patterns of what's happening in the world. And if we don't have the people who actually understand patterns in the world at tables about finance, I don't care if you're involved in social finance or not, if you're not actually paying attention to what's happening in the world, you're going to make dumb decisions. We did it in the lead up to 2008 by not paying attention to whether or not people were actually living in the houses that we had mortgages of. And now we're doing it again in private debt, and we're not paying attention to, is anybody actually at the wheel in the small businesses that are being funded by all these sort of, debt platforms that are exploding in terms of private debt. We just keep creating systems of finance that don't address a real economy. But the people who live in that real economy, work in that real economy, understand that real economy, need to actually be able to shape the way that systems of finance work. And so that's what we work on.
One of the questions that I like to ask guests is, do you think that an economy that works for all life is actually possible? And if so, what would it look like, or how long would that take to happen?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm not an economist. I'll dodge the question with the following statement. I don't know what an economy. We actually had a phrase for a long time that we were trying to move towards an economy that worked for all. And anytime I got asked what that meant, I couldn't name it. And partly because the economy is an abstraction, right? As an economy, it's an abstraction. And I don't know what that. I don't even know what it would mean to say that that abstraction was working for all. So I guess my answer is, it sounds pessimistic. I'll take a dodge. I mean, part of it for me is, how do we create market systems that function, right? I mean, I'm at a much more basic level, and the market system that I chose to focus on was finance. I think other people are focusing on consumer purchasing. People are focusing on incentives around land use. I mean, you can focus on all kinds of different market systems, transparency and sustainable fisheries, but at some level, figuring out how do we look at these systems that we've created that allow us to manage trade, manage the exchange of goods and services at a distance, right? So I'm kind of practical in this way. Like, at some level, I want to get granular in terms of what is the specific system that we're talking about, and how is it operating? And I find a lot of the ways that we talk about economies is framed much more in the abstraction. It's a capitalist economy. All right, like, I read Adam Smith. I think I know. I mean, I've read other things since then. I think I know what people mean by a capitalist economy, but it is an abstraction versus saying, how do I look at this particular transaction and how that transaction sits within another set of systems, and how the incentives around that work, and how the inhibitors work, and what is the goal that is this, what is the goal of the system, and how is that the goal that we actually want? So I'm much more of a kind of systems change person versus an abstract ideological change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm just one of the things I've been noticing, at least with maybe my own personal thinking about the next economy, is, I have cited the example of the book "What Color Is Your Parachute?" When looking for a job. It says you actually should create in detail what your dream job looks like what amount of money you want to make, the type of people you want to work with, the skills you love to use, and even though you might not think it's possible, it's worthwhile to actually create in detail the end goal, so that you can sort of guide yourself towards that. So I guess, like, part of what I've been curious about is, what are we actually, if we only work on the systems or the individual interactions, but there's not really like any there's not sort of a defined like set of end results. I'm like, it's easy to get swayed by someone like how do you decide between Hillary Clinton's vision versus Bernie Sanders' vision versus Donald Trump's vision? It's like you can be more easily swayed by them if you don't actually know what the end result is going to look like.
Yeah, but so this is where end results, though, are endlessly tempting. The kind of sense of, I can name the end goal, and therefore I can name a process that would get us from here to there. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's a fine thing for people to do from time to time. Let me try I've been working on this idea for a while, so it may be half baked, but there is a way in which, when we talk about an investment portfolio, right? So I sit on the board of a fairly large foundation, chair their investment committee, or actually, wait, I did until like a week ago. Anyway, I no longer chair. After 9 years, I no longer do. It's so much a part of my identity. Anyway, so imagine an investment portfolio, and what you name is the goal for that, right? We want to achieve 8% return, 7% return, 5% net of fees, 4% net of fees, whatever your goal is. And so you name that goal. And then the impact investing conversation has sort of said, well, we want you to name a new goal, right? So here, that sounds like a good idea, right? So we'll change the goal from 8% net of fees or 7% net of fees to sustainable agriculture. So here's the problem with how goals fit within finance. So if I name the goal that I want to get, and I'll like air quotes around the get, a 8% net of fees return, I don't get to just get that. I mean, this is what drives me crazy about, a below market return. Well, it's not like anybody promised you the market rate return either. That is just an expectation that is often wildly off base of what the human economy and the world's resources can actually produce for you. So we end up in finance in particular in this incredibly arrogant stance that says, you fund managers and then the companies they invest in and then the people that they employ, you get me an 8% return. As opposed to saying, how through the process of my engaging with a set of investments would I have the honor of participating in that economic activity, adding value where I can, and hopefully as a result of the negotiations that we made, I can also achieve some kind of return. But then when we change all of that to social return, we want the same thing. You world, you people in the world, you companies in the world, you go get me my social return. Because I got this goal. This is what I want to have happen. And so you go get it for me. And I think there is an arrogance in how we often name our desire for results and how we see the relationship between that and the complex human reality in which we're going to move forward. Now, I will say some of this is honestly colored a little bit by my faith tradition. I'm a Christian, Lutheran in particular, and there's a kind of belief that the world is always already broken, right? So this is this idea of grace, right? That you sort of end up in the world, and the arrogance of saying, I'm here to fix this is both arrogance and often creates more harm than good. So anyways, social change is always complicated though, right? I mean, we all do have to decide, what are we actually trying to create? What are we trying to get done? And how do we move forward? So I don't mean to say that that's not possible. I just think it's more problematic than we often own.
Yeah. I'm actually curious because one of the areas that I think you're one of the very few, at least in my knowledge, who are integrating religious Christian values and getting the church and faith community involved in impact investing. Could you speak a little bit to some of your work in that area?
Yeah, this has been the most consistent work. We've been doing this. I mean, again, when Criterion was founded, our biggest client was the Methodist Pension Fund. So been doing this for the 15 years that we've been in existence. And just as some people are born into money. I was born into church. And so my parents are both sort of influential theologians. So it was a world that I was comfortable with. So the ability to say, I'm going to go talk to the head of a denomination, or I'm going to go talk to a bishop feels like, I'm talking to family friends. So I think there's a comfort level that makes some of what I talk about, if you're not inside the church, it sounds really surreal. But again, the church is one of the largest leadership institutions in the world. I mean, it's just a massive organization of human beings who happen to show up every Sunday or Saturday night to do this worshiping thing together. And in that, they're trying to figure out how to live their lives. So our basic challenge to the church is to say, what if you saw some part of your mission, some part of your ministry as discovering God's economy? And the theological basis behind this is sort of looking at if one of the ways that we come to understand God is by looking at our relationships, right? There's all kinds of ways we come to understand God, but one of them is by seeing God in one another. And so if that's one of the ways we come to understand God, if that's one of the ways we come to understand God, and a significant amount of our relationships are economic, are financial, are transactional. What does God's economy look like? And so we challenge a sort of overall, sometimes this is incredibly challenging to have a conversation about, but we sort of say, instead of talking about the economy as profane, we suggest that there is a sacred element to how we're in economic relationships, and therefore it is the place of the church to understand how we can be in those relationships more fully. So we have a Bible study that actually at the end asks the church to go out and make a loan, not because we think by making these loans they're going to transform their local economy, but because if they make a loan, they're practicing being in a different kind of economic relationship. And then that gets sort of extrapolated to a macro level where we have a dialogue of a set of people who manage over $100 million in assets that actually looks at how do you do financial intermediation at a much bigger level. How would you design systems of financial intermediation that also led to those kinds of relationships? So yeah, we get to have fun.
That's great. Maybe a somewhat difficult question would be if there was, based on your experience, if there's one thing, a rule or regulation or a piece of finance that you would, if you could be benevolent dictator for today, what would you change that you think would have a sort of direct capital in a way that's more beneficial to all life?
I'll use this in a kind of random segue back to our gender work. I think one of the bigger challenges we've got right now in finance more broadly and genderless investing in particular is a kind of sense of counting women, right? oh, look, there's a woman entrepreneur. I invested in her. I therefore did gender lens investing because I put the metric of investing in 3 women, and oh, look, I did. Counting how many women were invested in, counting how many women on boards, all of that is really important from an overall framework of women's rights and human rights and making sure there's representation and diversity and all of that. But it doesn't capture the kind of full breadth of the experience of gender. So I ended up with this field that I've helped create becoming focused on a couple core indicators. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would expand the imagination of that. So if I could wave a magic wand, I would totally expand the imagination of that. How would we actually look more clearly at, or just at a basic level, violence against women? Violence against women has an equal impact. It's just a profound impact on the world in terms of women's ability to manage their sense of possibility, what transportation systems they use, how they form and end and begin relationships, what products they buy, how they dress. Like, there is a massive amount of who we understand ourselves to be that's defined by this sort of endemic nature of violence against women. I'm working in Papua New Guinea right now, and the numbers are just staggering. Something like 20 to 30% of women in Papua New Guinea who are married experience domestic violence. That's a norm at a level that's just mind-boggling. So if I could wave a magic wand in finance, I would want that the people who are sitting in decision-making, who are doing the analysis, who are thinking through what matters in finance, are looking at a broader range of indicators. And this is where I think climate finance has done just a brilliant job of expanding how to consider all of the dynamics and the risk factors that emerge out of climate change in finance. I want the same things to happen around gender. And I would really like the same things to happen around class and race and a set of other issues that are also not at the table.
Yeah, it seems like in particular with gender and even with investing in people of color and LGBT community, there seems to be in impact investing still the assumption, and you mentioned it, that, oh, I'm going to do impact investing, but I still want my 8% return and I want exits. And so the limited partners are still the same, but the sort of investments are maybe in women or people of color. And so the beneficiaries of like an investment doing well is like an increase in wealth inequality because you have, maybe a woman-owned business goes public, but then it's still the same white males who own the large like funds that are investing. So I'm curious if you found organizations or areas where gender lens investing maybe supports the entrepreneurs and also is more beneficial on the capital side. Have you found anything in that area?
You laid up a complicated set of assumptions that we should actually be, I think there, so I agree that there's too many fees charged within finance. There's too many people making a disproportionate amount of money, and the concentration of capital in the hands of a few, overall is like a really great idea. I think jumping from that to, so I still, though, like, even though all of that is true, I think the lever of change is not to say you have the wrong goals, but to change you have the wrong processes, you have the wrong analytics. And so maybe this is where we enter in. Because if I said, you don't deserve to make that kind of return, and in fact, you don't deserve to have that capital, it's kind of a non-starter of a conversation. But where we can have an enormous amount of impact is, I'll just take what we're doing in the Pacific right now, is a set of impact investors who are, the Australian government is incenting them to sort of pay attention to impact investing in the Pacific. And we're sort of wrapping around that issue and saying, oh, okay, well, as these impact investors in Australia pay attention to the Pacific, let's make sure their cultural assumptions are not wild, or that they're not taking a hammer of private equity and the assumptions, particularly of private equity that's venture capital, and then looking at Papua New Guinea and saying, how come there aren't enough high-growth tech companies here for me to invest in? As opposed to saying, look, there's this amazing mile of coffee production. How could we use finance as a tool to help that set of coffee production both improve the experience for the workers and also get a return based on the type of capital we're using. I mean, impact investing became synonymous with private equity going directly into entrepreneurs. And there are so many other kinds of finance, and a relatively few number of people on the planet actually describe themselves as entrepreneurs versus people who just own businesses. So it created a set of frameworks that we're frankly working our way out of, right? So to say, here's a private equity deal and I expect this and you're going to produce this for me, I want to step back and say, is that even the right kind of finance to be talking about? And then how do we think about all the toys? And that's sort of what we've been really pushing. In one of the things I'm most excited about within Criterion is this training program that we've launched over the last year, which really steps back and says, all right, how do we use finance as a tool for social change? And then what are the tools of finance? And how do we make that a broader conversation? And so that we're not just, picking up the hammer that we already know. And what's great is that, in general, the feedback we've gotten over the couple hundred people that have gone through this in the last year, one is that people who work in finance are thrilled to kind of be reminded that there are all these other toys that might not be what they have within their private equity or public equity fund. But it also works for the people who don't know finance to say, here's my stack of cards that define some words that I feel alienated from.
I love that idea. Maybe you could speak a little bit more about the training program. Is it
Sure.
on your website or?
Yeah, it's on our website. I think if you go to our website, Toolkit's all over it. So it's called Toolkit for Finance as a Strategy for Social Change. We have one coming up in Boston and one in San Francisco. We do about 5 or 6 a year that are public that anybody can come to. But the bulk of the toolkits that we do are within either an organization or a network that wants to sort of do this as a community, because then they can support each other. But it was fun. We just had our first alumni call yesterday of the people who have actually gone through Toolkit and brought them back together. And we're going to start doing this quarterly of just having a conversation about what did it take to take the next couple steps in implementation and what did you learn. So it's fun to come up with. It took us about 2 years to design this, and it's really cool. It's like a bag of cards. And so it's actually really tangible. Like it's not, some sort of abstract theory or a set of case studies that don't quite relate to who you are. They're just like a set of cards that can be used to design a strategy. Anyway, it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. And I was just noticing, looks like April 20th in San Francisco and then May 15th in Boston.
That's correct. Thank you so much. I should know those dates.
I'm going to have to check those out because I'm in the Bay Area. So
that'd be great. It'd be great.
So let's see here. A few more questions for you. Who else are you looking to, like who's really inspiring to you and who's kind of on the leading edge, either it's individual, like a thought leader or organization that really is kind of doing this work that you really look up to?
That's a great question. So I have enormous respect for the current head of the Ms. Foundation, Teresa Younger. She's just sort of redefining feminism and actually redefining feminism as as connected to race and class. As you can hear, a lot of our push right now is really around looking at intersectionality. She kind of kicks it. She and I are actually working on we're writing something together about a blueprint for women's organizations to engage in finance. All right, the other person I'm in love with these days is a woman named Michelle Birdsall, who's the treasurer of the American Baptist Home Mission Society. And she and I have been friends for about 8 years, and she's one of those, I love those subtle social change players where they watch their environment and figure out what's the right moment to step in. And so she called me a couple months ago and she's like, all right, we've been talking for 6 years now. And holy crap, now is feeling like, pretty damn exciting. But it's that kind of really subtle, I can watch institutional change, the broader dynamics. I think too many of us are kind of blunt instruments trying to pound our ideas into other people. And I like subtlety.
And are there other things the listeners can help support your work with? Like obviously the trainings coming up, other ways that folks can support and help you grow the next economy?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're a pretty porous organization. I would say every year we probably have about 50 or so volunteers. We do a lot of research. So we do 3 things. We do research, training, and then we engage with institutions more broadly. Our volunteers I don't know if volunteers are the right word to describe them. They're usually very senior people who, or just straight out of college or making some transition. It's like a wildly diverse crowd. And they show up and just want to help, either do a research project or help us push something forward. And it really lets us punch above our weight, just in terms of what we can get done. Same is true of our donors. We have a set of about 40 donors or so who make our world work. They don't fill in the gaps. The contracts that we do are sustainable. The training programs that we run are financially sustainable. Our donors let us stand in the face of power. And that's really, as an organization that named a commitment to changing who sees themselves in the conversation, we can't need to be paid to be in a conversation or be afraid that if we say the wrong thing, we're gonna lose our livelihood. And so it's not so much. It's not just that they're donors. It's that they're also people who say, "We'll stand by you when the shit hits the fan." I would say, as I think about the world of impact investing, I could name 100 people, 200 people who I've been friends with for years and years and years, who I know in a heartbeat would stand with us. And I'm always game for more people who will stand with us. But I guess my ask is always, go find somebody to stand with. Like, lots more people need air cover for doing something bold and brave than we possibly imagine. With whatever power people have, I think they have it to be able to share it, to not just protect themselves, but to take a moment to make sure somebody else can show up in a different way.
And where can folks learn more, perhaps contact information or website or social media?
Yeah, so Criterion Inst is our Twitter. CriterionInstitute.org is our website. I'm quite reachable at Anderson@CriterionInstitute.org. And if in general, aspirationally always game to talk to people, but then there's the tyranny of an actual schedule.
Absolutely. Well, cool, Joy. This is very great.
Glad.
I just wanted to honor that, you're one of the few people that really authentically holds the activist side and the sort of deep knowledge of the financial system. So I just really want to appreciate you for holding that space, because I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, thanks. Proud to do it.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll get to chat again soon with some updates on your work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our past episodes, visit www.lifteconomy.com. You can also subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Once again, thanks for listening.